This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work, responding to another Ask Prof. Wolff question from our Patreon community. And this one comes from Comrade Roo. This comrade asks a question. What is the relationship, in effect, that's what the question asks, between prices and wages? Comrade Roo has learned, as have so many, in school and from newspapers and casual comments by politicians and so on, that there's something called a wage-price spiral. And the idea here is that sometimes prices go up and then wages go up and then prices go up, kind of chasing each other and producing one of those great mysteries of the capitalist system, inflation, about which as much nonsense is written as about any other topic you can think of. So let's get very basic and very simple so we can understand this issue, and then look at what Comrade Roo wants us to, namely, is capitalism a system of private enterprises organized hierarchically in each enterprise, more or less vulnerable, susceptible to these kinds of spirals than an economy would be if it were based on worker co-ops, enterprises in which workers are not only the people who do the work, but are likewise the people who run the enterprise, something fundamentally different from capitalism. All right, let's begin. There is no necessary relationship between prices and wages. What do I mean? There are plenty of examples in history where prices go up because the businesses who run the economy raise them. Let's remember how a price goes up. The seller raises the price. In a capitalist system, the people who own or run the enterprise, the owner, the board of directors of a corporation, they decide when and how much to raise prices for what they sell. Can prices go up without wages going up? Absolutely, happens all the time. In business school, where modern capitalists learn their trade, they learn that you should always charge as much as the market will bear. Here's the idea. The more the price is raised, the more profit you will be able to earn. After all, you know what your costs are. If you're a good capitalist, you've already purchased your inputs, hired your workers, both of those at the lowest possible price you need to pay. Then you put them to work, they produce an output, and now it's in your interest, of course, to sell that output at the highest price that you can. You have to be careful not to raise the price so far that fewer people will buy it, because that'll eat into your profits. So you've got to find the delicate point where you've raised it as much as you can and still get enough people to buy it to maximize your profit. And that's what you're taught to do. If you've done that, then let's suppose wages go up by a bit. Sure, if you have to pay higher wages, you would like to raise prices so that you stay even. But the fact that a capitalist would like to do that doesn't mean that he can. If in fact the only way you could raise a price when wages go up would risk you lose business because people can't afford to pay a higher price, then you won't do it because it would be non-profit maximizing. You're not going to do that. You know what happens then? You suck it up as a capitalist. That's right. You pay higher wages, and you cannot, because it is not rational for you, raise prices. It'll cost you in sales more than the price increase will help you. In other words, there's no necessary relationship. Let me give you another example, maybe easier to understand. Suppose wages go down, maybe because workers are desperate to hold on to jobs and you can lower their wages and they'll still stay working for you. Or maybe immigrants will come into an area. Or maybe people in an area like teenagers or women coming out of the home will be desperate for work. And so they will accept lower wages. Or maybe our business has moved from one part of the country or one part of the world to another to be able to pay lower wages. Does that necessarily mean that this capitalist will lower prices? Not at all. The history of the last 40 years has been hundreds, thousands of American companies closing work here, closing factories, stores, offices, warehouses, and moving them to other parts of this country or abroad to be able to pay lower wages. And they kept the difference between the lower wages and the prices they did not lower correspondingly, because that fattens their profits, and that's what they're in business to do. In other words, there's no necessary relationship. Don't make the mistake of thinking that what a capitalist might like to do will be possible for him, in fact, to do. And don't make the mistake of thinking that if something is cheaper for a capitalist, such as hiring workers, that will necessarily bring down the prices. It might, but that will depend on other circumstances and the calculations that capitalists make, since they're the key decision makers on all these issues. Having said that, let's look at what happens if we have an inflation and we want to control it. We think there are people suffering from higher prices, pricing them out of the ability to buy the items whose price is rising. Milk for their children, gasoline for their car, a home for their family, whatever it is. In capitalism, it's very hard to control inflation. You know why? Because of the private enterprise system. Capitalists do not want anyone interfering in their freedom to raise and lower prices as they see fit. That's how they maximize their profits. So they resist any social control over prices, which means if they're believing that price rises will enhance their profits, they want the freedom to do that. They do not want any responsibility for the consequences of their freedom, which is always a very dangerous sign for any hope of democracy. The United States became an independent country fighting against Britain because they did not want to suffer from the freedom of King George III in England to do all kinds of things, for example, taxing them, without their having some say in all of this. They wanted King George to be accountable for the consequences of what he did. And we went to war in the United States to establish that idea. But capitalists don't want to be accountable for the inflation that will result if they raise their prices. So they resist. If worker co-ops were the economy, they wouldn't need to, because it's all the same people who do the work and run the businesses. They don't care if they raise their prices, but it comes back to haunt them that they can't then afford to buy what the higher prices cost. then they won't do that because they're just as dependent on the prices they pay as they are on the prices they earn. Worker co-ops, for example, would be much more ready to pass a law that says you cannot raise your prices. Nobody can. If a law like that is passed, we don't have an inflation. Not really very hard to control if you think about it. On August 15th of 1971, a conservative president of the United States, Richard Nixon, imposed a wage price freeze on the U.S. economy. He announced that any capitalist who raised a price would be arrested and go to jail. Guess what? The inflation of that time collapsed, and we didn't have one. Are there consequences to fixing prices and wages? Sure there are. Just like there are consequences not doing that. The whole point is, do you have a democratic way to think about, discuss, and decide which way to go? Answer: in capitalism, not at all. That decision is basically dominated by the tiny minority of people who are capitalist employers. This is Richard Wolff for Democracy at Work.